Welcome to Green Building Matters, the podcast that matters for green building professionals. Learn insight in green buildings as we interview today's experts in LEED and WELL. We'll learn from their career paths, war stories, and all things green, because green building matters. And now our host, and yes, he has every LEED and WELL credential. Here's Charlie Cicchetti.
Be sure to check out the Green Building Matters community, where you can have unlimited exam prep for any of the professional credential exams you're tackling next, as well as putting your continuing education on autopilot, saving time with GBS reporting your hours on your behalf. Check it out, gbes.com/join. Now, enjoy this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. Today we have a special guest because I want to go ahead and say thank you to Sue Clark, who is a LEED fellow coming to us from Stockholm, Sweden. And a career highlight of mine was actually in 2019 to go teach a 2-day WELL training. So Sue, if I haven't told you thank you enough, thank you. I fell in love with Stockholm and I can't wait to show everybody more of your story. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Charlie. Great to be here.
You're just good people, good energy. I know we're going to have a fun chat. And I always ask my podcast guests, Sue, take us back. Where'd you grow up and where'd you go to school?
Right. So I'm actually a farm kid from central Canada, Brandon, Manitoba. I grew up on a beef cattle farm and was one of the first of my generation actually to not continue with farming. So it's been a bit of a step outside of my upbringing to come into architecture. I think this was really actually an important basis for getting into sustainability, this kind of early experience with connecting to nature and to the land and understanding when you work in something like agriculture, your livelihood is bound up intrinsically with what happens with nature and you have very little control over that. And it could be the case that one summer you have a bumper crop and the next summer there's a late season storm that takes all of that away and you lose a season's worth of work. So I think for me, it inspired a sense of humility as well as a sense of the responsibility that we have as custodians for nature. So when later in my education and then in my career, sustainability just seemed like a self-evident direction.
It's one of those roots, that early influence there. And so how did you go from a family farming to want to know architecture and maybe go to school for that? So what inspired you to go that route?
I actually started off at art school. I went to art school in Vancouver at the Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design. And while I was there, I started having the idea about switching into architecture instead, because I saw that architecture looked at issues very broadly. I had a couple of professors that were architects, and they also shared that architecture is a great education for looking at things comprehensively, whether you take that education and then do graphic design or industrial design. If you go into literature, if you go into city planning, you can go many directions with an architecture education. So that really interested me. So before I completed my studies at art school, I switched to the architecture program at the University of Waterloo, and I did my master's there. It's a co-op program, so you go to school for 4 months and then you work for 4 months. And one of my work terms, I landed at an engineering firm in Ottawa, which is really where I got my first start with green building. In 2004, I got to work on my first LEED project. It was one of the first LEED Canada projects. LEED Canada came out in September 2004, and I started working for Morrison Hershfield as a co-op student later that month. So it was just a tremendous opportunity to get in early. Halfway through my master's, I went back to Morrison Hershfield and became their first dedicated green employee. They had several people that were building science people that were also working with sustainability, but this was 2007. At the time, there wasn't really critical mass of projects to justify dedicated staff for green building. But 2007 was the beginning of that hockey stick curve upwards. So I was able really to learn and develop even before I finished my master's, and get in with a firm that was really thinking creatively about sustainability with a strong technical background, which I really appreciated as well.
It's amazing. Right place, right time, that early LEED Canada project. What kind of building was it, Sue? Just curious.
It was actually a major renovation of the Revenue Canada building in Regina, Saskatchewan. We overachieved on the client's goals. They wanted just a certified level. We were able to get silver. We did some building reuse stuff. It was just a great chance to hop in and get my hands dirty.
Here's how we should do this. We'll talk about mentors for a minute. Is there anyone along the way that opened some doors for you, or maybe you kind of looked up to?
No shortage of those. And I wouldn't be where I am today without having people to take me under their wing and guide me along. And I'd say my old boss at Morrison Hershfield, Mark Lusick, who was one of the first LEED fellows in Canada, chaired the LEED steering committee in Canada. He was always able to introduce me to opportunities, but also just a great sounding board and kept things real. Having himself been part of this early green building movement since the 70s and the 80s, Mark always saw the forest for the trees. So I think when you work with a system like LEED, especially when you're new to working with it, you can really get hung up on the requirements. And Mark would always kind of pull me back into, okay, well, what's the intent of the credit? What's really the sustainability goal that we're trying to achieve? How can we catch people doing the right thing? And this was really an instrumental lesson for me. And how do we make sure that we keep our perspective broad and inclusive and not have too much of these LEED blinders on, which can be a criticism of the system, of any certification system.
Anyone else there have some influence along the way you want to give a shout out to?
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my boss at Sweden Green Building Council, who I met at a conference in Toronto, Green Build Toronto in 2011, just a few weeks before I moved to Sweden. SGBC was only 3 people at the time. They had just signed this letter of agreement with US Green Building Council to support LEED in Sweden. But these 3 staff people didn't have any experience of LEED. I was coming from Canada with experience using LEED outside of the US in a cold weather climate, in a country with high requirements for energy efficiency. So it was really a good chance for me to hop in, and Bengt Wongren is his name. He really just said, just take the ball and run with it. Whatever you want to do to develop how we work with LEED. So I was able to set up a LEED committee and some working groups to tackle things like what do we see for potential in pilot credits? What do we need to focus on for energy issues? How do we need to better communicate to SGBC, who owns LEED, how we're working with district energy questions, which was a huge challenge for us in the early days? What are the material requirement concerns that we're having difficulty working with, the way that we measure emissions versus the way that LEED measures emissions? So Bengt really gave me a ton of freedom to drive that work as I thought would be most productive. But he also introduced me to the people that I really depended on to develop this technical, rigorous work, because I'm not obviously an expert on everything, but I was able to tap into a network of people that were experts on everything. So to be the spider in the web, I really have to thank Bengt for that.
Well, I can't wait till we get back to in-person green build conferences. You can see that connection you made there and how impactful it was on your green building career, Sue. But connect the dots. So here you are in Canada. How did you pick Stockholm, Sweden, and what brought you to Stockholm?
Well, it wasn't actually my pick. My husband worked for a telecom company called Nortel. They got bought by Ericsson, and they offered him a 1 to 3 year contract in Stockholm. And he got the offer and said to me, "What do you think?" And I said, "Yes, it's a mecca for green building. Let's go. Something will pan out. I'll land on my feet." I met Bengt, I think 6 weeks before we got here. So we were originally only planning to stay for 1 year, but it's not often that the Ericsson spouse finds work. Swedish language can be a barrier, especially for some industries, to finding work here. It can be a lot to settle in and find a job in that time. But I was able to hop into SGBC almost directly after I got here. So we decided to extend, and eventually we just decided to stay. Now it's been 9 years, and it's kind of hard to imagine leaving now, having only come here on a long-term assignment. But it's definitely been a tremendous experience to have this kind of point of comparison, what it's like to work in two different countries, even two countries that have a lot of similarities in very important ways, just to understand how do consultants interface with contractors? What are these leadership examples? How do both of these different building cultures work with innovation? It's just been such an eye-opener.
Really happy you're there. It seems like it's really working out very well for you and your family. So tell us a little bit about Sweden, especially there in Stockholm, right? We have another program, Miljöbyggnad, right? And then there's LEED, but in a little bit, we'll talk about WELL and how you've really become a WELL liaison. So could you just kind of tell us about some of the programs that projects do? I know there's obviously some LEED work, but there's some other programs you have to choose from. Can you paint the picture for those that haven't been to Sweden yet?
Sure. Sweden's a bit of a tapestry of different certification systems and environmental standards. And I think one of the important things that I would mention is that in a way that's kind of different from the Canadian or the US market, where LEED was really a catalyst for green building, there were these movements happening in Sweden already, and the certification trend came after as a way of quantifying these things. So in the 1970s, energy crisis hit Sweden as everywhere else. The big difference is that in Sweden, there's no fossil fuel resources within the national borders. So the pressure stayed on to resolve this issue of dependence on fossil fuels, especially for heating buildings. They developed really stringent energy standards, a lot of work with the district heating networks and getting them off of fossil fuels. Shortly thereafter, they started to work a lot more with hazardous chemicals and building materials and transparency. There was an individual working for one of Sweden's large contractor firms who was talking to some of his colleagues and held up a can of cat food and said, why is it I can see everything that's in this cat food, but if I buy 20 sheets of drywall, I can't find out what's in it, or 20 sheets of particle board, I can't find out what's in it. We need to change this. There is also a crisis with a big housing program from the 60s and 70s where they built 1 million homes in a decade, which is a pretty outstanding achievement for a country that wasn't even 10 million people at the time. But they built a lot of these things very fast and had some moisture and humidity issues with undercured concrete slabs. So they've worked quite proactively with moisture and mold safety practices. So this is all a backdrop to when certification came along. It had all of these kind of pillars that it could anchor on and develop good practice behind what was already good practice within the industry. So the most popular system in Sweden is called Miljöbyggnad. It's a direct translation is environmental building. That's about 1,700 buildings in Sweden. But we also have almost 300 LEED projects, about the same amount of BREEAM projects, the Swedish version of BREEAM. We have a Swedish system for certifying urban areas. WELL is catching on. So it's a more complicated certification landscape than you'd see in a place like Canada or the US or many other countries where there's one system that's very dominant with not so much for other systems being taken up. And the uptake of those systems has really depended on what the focus of the property owner and what kind of clientele they're trying to draw in. Property owners that want to bring in international clients have moved towards LEED because it has this high level of recognition. It's the same system everywhere you go. So that's really where we've seen the traction for the LEED market here.
That's what I was going to ask is, because along the way, as we talk more about your career and your story, you've been able to work on as a consultant, LEED projects, the other rating systems, well projects, all while doing great work, of course, at the Sweden Green Building Council and at Tengbom, which we're going to talk about. So is it the developers driving it? And it sounds like it's really just you want to be a good consultant and show here's the pros and cons of each. Here's the audience. Here's the other goals. It sounds like you're starting with, well, we've got a lot of options. Let's narrow it down. Is that kind of how the talk goes?
Yeah, what we've always talked about at the Green Building Council is we see it as something of a ladder. So there's a very basic certification a project can earn that's simply based on energy performance. And for some property owners and some clients, this is their foot in the door. If they want to get a bit more complicated, they can use a system like Miljöbyggnad, which has 16 indicators, all of which are based on the Swedish Building Code. So if you are building to Swedish Building Code, which everybody must, you have a really direct inroads to Miljöbyggnad. But it's also a way of verifying that the building is designed, performing to that expectation. So it gives something to the client as well. It's not just that, well, why do I use a system that's only based on the code? Well, it provides this level of assurance also for ongoing performance. For projects that want to take on an extra level of complexity, because Miljöbyggnad doesn't have anything about waste management or where the project is located, site factors like public transportation, et cetera. Then you have BREEAM and LEED. We've presented to our clients that want to go even further. You can look at Living Building Challenge. And now we have this piece with health and well-being that we're really seeing as a complement to the environmental certification system. So the first 3 projects that registered to WELL in the Swedish market, one was pursuing LEED, one was pursuing BREEAM, one was pursuing Miljöbyggnad. So it's great to see that it's not just one of the environmental certification systems that's developing along the health and wellness trend. It's really universal. So I think we see that it's getting to be more complex like that, more double certifications with WELL and an environmental certification. We also have this system for urban areas. So how can we look at the urban scale and not just the building scale?
Wow, that's such a cool landscape there. There's so many options, so many tools. Let's look back for a minute. I love to give my podcast guests a little permission to look back on the highlight reel, if you will. So what are some of your proudest achievements that stand out?
One little project that I'm actually really proud of, and it maybe isn't the most flashy project, but I worked on a waste management or waste handling station on Vancouver Island in British Columbia that had a really ambitious team. The client wanted to get as many sustainability strategies as they could packed into this little project. It was part renovation, part new construction, did everything in certified wood. We put green roofs on everything. We put skylights in the waste transfer halls. The project got to LEED Gold, and it was just such an achievement for the team. But I think more than anything, it was this elevation of the building type, because at the time, this would have been 2009, 2010. At the time, it was like LEEDs for office buildings, and maybe a school, but it wasn't really being embraced by these industrial building types. But there was so much potential there that we could stretch sustainability and the LEED system and develop it in a way that actually pushed us to do that building type better as well. And it kind of took the confines off of the LEED system and its definition as a system for office buildings. So I was really proud of the project team and the fact that any strategy we talked about, they were really open, really eager to try out new things, try out new technologies, and that was definitely a highlight. And it's come in handy in future conversations as well. That yes, WELL isn't only for office buildings. We can also use it for this, just to think more creatively about systems that maybe get pigeonholed in a certain way, especially when that system is new.
It's inspiring. You kind of got me excited about how that was that catalyst there. You're a LEED fellow, which is amazing. So tell us about that. Is that validation? Is that what has that done for you? What has that meant to you?
It's definitely a big honor. It's a tough road to get there. And as you know yourself, and congratulations again, Charlie, on your 2020 LEED Fellow Award. It's honored company that you get elevated into. And it's definitely something that I had in my sights, I'd say, for a while. You need to prepare yourself for getting to a LEED Fellow, and that's a several years long process. But I feel like as soon as I got my LEED Fellow, I just started thinking right away about who I was going to nominate, because there were a lot of people that helped me along my way. Like I mentioned about working with SGBC and being tied into this network of experts. Some of my colleagues from Skanska, from Piacon, from Bengt Dahlgren, and one of our big engineering firms here, they have just been such an anchor for my technical development as a LEED consultant that I think a LEED Fellow designation invariably has a lot of endorsements behind it. It doesn't exist kind of in a self-contained vacuum. It feels like my LEED Fellow award actually belongs to a lot more people. It should be considered like a Swedish LEED Community Award almost, that I've been very fortunate to be outward face of. But definitely it's nice to get Sweden on the map. We don't have so many LEED Fellows in Europe. I think we're 5 or 6 LEED Fellows in Europe, and so far just one in the Nordics. But I think it does speak to the kind of quality of work that's coming out of the Nordics when it comes to sustainability. And I fully expect we'll see a lot more LEED Fellows in the next few years once people pass that 8-year qualification as a LEED AP roadblock. I think we'll see a lot more, because the quality of work coming out of the Swedish market is really exceptional.
Top notch. Yeah, like I said, we really fell in love with the area when we were able to visit. So let's fast forward to today. What's keeping you busy today? Obviously, you have work to do there on it almost seems like a healthy building connection still with SGBC, but obviously tell us about Tengbom and some of the other work you do back on the architecture project side. I think you had an itch to kind of get back to that side a little bit. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Tengbom is one of the oldest architectural firms in the world. I think we are 107 years old. So there's really a long architectural history. And it was the chance, having been educated as an architect, it was the chance to kind of get back to those roots and start to have the conversations with architectural colleagues about, how do we integrate health and wellness into every building that we design. Our head of sustainability, who's also an architect, Ivana Kilsgaard, she's been extremely ambitious about really digging into this question about what is a true sustainable architecture. How is every building that we send out of the firm, how can it be healthier, climate ready, low carbon impact, circular? How can we build in more reuse? What are all these pieces that need to come together? So it's been more network building within the organization to talk to interior architects and landscape architects and city planners. How are we embracing these different aspects of sustainability? How can we do even more? So for my own work, I'd say it's starting to become more strategic, whereas before it might have been more consulting, LEED consulting. Now it's taken on a bit more of a big picture feel of beyond the systems. How do we define those sustainability goals and then find the system that scratches the itch in those different places? Especially when we start to look at these emerging legislations. The EU taxonomy, for example, is putting a renewed focus on EU's goal for carbon neutrality, where we've got different directives that are targeting reuse and circularity, going to make it mandatory that when you buy something, you can also buy replacement component parts for it instead of throwing it in the garbage. Even in Sweden, in January next year, we're going to have a mandatory requirement for a climate declaration. So an LCA on the building structure will be mandatory for all public buildings as of January 1st and for all other buildings in May or in June. So we also have some internal competence that we need to develop to address these emerging legislative trends.
It's a good segue to kind of my next question, which is what is around the corner? What else are you seeing in this green building, healthy building movement? What should me and those listening to this podcast do? What should we be reading up on now? What's around the corner?
I feel like there's a big gap that we need to fill on this climate adapted building piece. So about a year ago, the government of Canada announced they were going to update the national building codes for future climate scenarios, which I think is really smart because the climate we have today that our building codes are designed for, we're not going to have the same climatic conditions in 10 or 20 or 30 years. The climate in Stockholm in 2050 is anticipated to be as hot as Budapest. Our buildings are not designed for that kind of heat. Our infrastructures are not designed for that kind of heat. And it won't be as simple as just plopping an air conditioner into all of our buildings. We've got restrictions on the levels of refrigerants that we're even able to sell, let alone their global warming potential. So we need to start working much more aggressively with what are the standards that we build our buildings to. We know that when we put up an office building, it's going to be there for 50 or 60 years. What kind of climate can we reasonably expect in 2080 or 2090? We can tap into data that shows us what are the forecast scenarios. What are the temperature changes going to be in different areas of the country and different areas of the world? What about floodplains? What about increased flash storms and what that means for facade design? What about increased freeze-thaw cycles in places that no longer have the winters that they used to? So this, I think, is a huge opportunity. I know that there's some organizations that are already working on tools, but to have tools that would let us just pop in an address and have it give us, here's the top 3 climate risks for that specific location, ABC, and then implement design strategies for that. It would be a start. But I feel like this is something that we really haven't tapped into. The big climate focus right now is on reducing operational carbon and reducing embodied carbon. And absolutely, we need to put an effort there. But we can't ignore this piece of that our buildings are not designed appropriately for future conditions.
You're right. These rating systems that we get used to, and I've done it a while, you've done it a while, sometimes that's just the tool. And instead, it's so forward thinking. I love it. Database of what are your top 3 climate risks, and here's the pro tips on how to go ahead and navigate it to those buildings that aren't going to do LEED or anything like that. It's like, go ahead and set up all buildings for, hey, you got to be talking about this. This is something that's a known fact. So
yeah, and it's not even that it's that far in the future. 2 years ago, there were 700 premature deaths in Sweden in July because of the heat wave. And Stockholm's located on the 59th parallel. We're a long way away from the equator, and we are having premature death due to heat waves. We need to design our buildings different.
You're right. Wow, what a great conversation. A few rapid fire questions for you, Sue, so we can get to know you a little more. What do you think is your specialty or gift? What are you really good at?
Oh, it's probably this being the spider in the web and pulling all the different pieces together. It's really been a highlight of my career, I think, to work with these big groups of experts and try to pull all these little different pieces together into a concrete argument, whether we're trying to present how we work with district energy or how we're working with materials or how we think that LEED should update its daylight credit for northern latitudes. I think if I have a strength, it's that it's knitting together all of these little bits of information into a concrete whole that's readily digestible.
That I would, from as I've gotten to know you, I definitely agree with that. So do you have any good habits, any routines or rituals?
Yeah, I suppose one of the things that I kind of dug into even more in 2020, and I know a lot of people have kind of gotten back to baking sourdough bread from scratch and doing watercolors, but I do a lot of knitting. That's really my crafty passion. And it's also very, very meditative. There's a lot of articles actually that came out last year about the meditative benefits of knitting. You just can kind of turn your brain into an automatic mode. You have this tactile sense of working with your hands. It can prevent Alzheimer's later in life because you're doing something that's coordinated with your 2 hands in different ways. So it's also kind of a cozy activity that you can do at home. You don't have to be outside. You can do it by yourself. So that's maybe one of my good habits. It's a sort of meditation to be able to knit.
Those are good pro tips. You're hearing it from someone that's really practiced on it. Let's talk bucket list. You helped me check off a bucket list item going to Sweden, so that's amazing. What's on the bucket list? Maybe it's travel and adventure. Maybe it's write a book. Who knows? What are one or two things on your bucket list?
Yeah, I would really like to, I think, expand on this connection between sectors like architecture and the nonprofit world. I think specifically there's opportunities to work with schools, with school children. There's an initiative here called Generation PEP, and it's driven by the Crown Princess and her husband to create healthier conditions for children, to get them moving more, to get them eating better. When I read about it, I just saw this interface with WELL. So I think it would be on my bucket list to explore some sort of a project where you could connect a nonprofit initiative with a focus on kids with the building industry, and how can we make built environments that help kids to eat better and help kids to move more. I think that would be definitely a highlight if I could pursue that. Travel, it'd be nice to travel again. It's been a long time since I was on a plane. Yeah, after I can do the rounds of getting back to my family, I'd really like to go to South America. I've never been. Chile is definitely on my list. And to go back to Asia, I've only been to Korea, South Korea. So I would really love to explore more of Asia as well.
Thanks. I always love to hear where you want to go. And you may know some green building folks down there, like in Peru and Chile. So let me know. We do some education work down.
I will.
I can't wait either. So let's talk books. Is there a book or two you'd recommend?
Sure. For green building related, I read recently Joseph Allen and John McCumber's book on healthy buildings, which I think is a really good primer to anyone that wants to get working with healthy buildings. It came out right before COVID, but I think you see a lot of the messages in it being reiterated, especially if you follow Joseph Allen on LinkedIn. I've got a book for Christmas that I could totally recommend. It's called The End of Everything. It was on the New York Times bestseller list by the astrophysicist J.D. Mack. And it's about basically how the universe ends and the different scenarios for this grand event. Will it be that everything continues to expand? Will there be a massive contraction? Will we degrade right down to the level of our own molecules and atoms? Will there be a vacuum decay? It's super nerdy, but she puts it in terms that are really digestible. So it's actually a really fun read that when you're stuck in these pandemic times and it feels like time is almost standing still, it's kind of a useful exercise to put your head into a mind space of trillions of years now, when something very different might be happening. It just kind of helps to put it in perspective.
We'll link to that in the podcast show notes. At first, it sounded like a horror story, but now that you've kind of given me some perspective, you're right. It's way beyond us, much bigger, and definitely learned something there. So that's good. Good book recommendations. Thank you. All right. As we come to a close, two questions. One, is there anything you wish you'd have known earlier in your career?
I probably would have started university a little bit sooner. I didn't go to school until I was 25, and then I spent 11 years in there. So I was a bit long in the tooth by the time I got out of school. But I think if you start early, you really have even more opportunities to go different places and travel. If you have those opportunities while you're in university, 100% take them. Go do that term abroad. The kind of perspective that you get living in different places, learning different languages, eating different food, having different social interactions, they're just invaluable. So that would be something that I would wish on my younger self.
Great advice. And finally, let's say there's someone listening right now that is just now jumping into the green building movement. Any words of encouragement for them?
I would say two things would be really important. The first is just be audacious. Don't be too shy. Don't be afraid to go up to that person that's standing on the stage talking that you think gave a great speech and put out your hand and ask them to go for coffee. My friend Beth Hyder nominated me for my LEED fellow. And I think 8 years before that, Beth was a speck on a stage at the very first Women in Green breakfast at Greenbuild in 2012. And I never could have imagined that I would get to meet her, let alone get to be friends, let alone have her as a mentor to me. But for that audacity of approaching and having weird conversations, we talk about astrology, we talk about knitting. So I would say just be audacious. If there's someone that you've read an article about them or heard a podcast, you admire what they've said, just send them an email. Maybe you don't get an answer, but maybe you do. And this industry is just so much about personal relationships that I'd say it's really totally worth doing. And the other thing I would recommend is beware the specialization. Stay a generalist as long as you can. I think the people out there that are really great at sustainability are really great generalists. And there will always be this temptation to go down these different rabbit holes of sustainability, like become a daylight expert or an LCA expert. And it's not that these things aren't fantastic, but the more you specialize, the more you have to sacrifice this comprehensive picture. And in order to pull all of these different pieces together, you really need to have that generalist perspective. So even if you're specializing, try to just keep things as broad as you can. Don't get too specialized, because if you look at the Brendan Owens of the world or the Beth Hyders of the world, these people are crazy generalists. They know a little bit about everything. And it allows them to see the connections between things that's so important in this line of work.
Amazing advice. You got two nuggets there to our listeners. Everyone, this has been Sue Clark coming to us from Stockholm, Sweden. Sue, thank you. You are just a green building guru, but just a ton of fun to talk to. So everybody connect with Sue on LinkedIn. And Sue, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Charlie. You're welcome back to Stockholm anytime.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At GBES.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.